All right, so welcome everybody to my talk, the RTOS Exploit Mitigation Blues. A little introduction, my name is Jos Wetzels, and I'm currently an independent security researcher with Midnight Blue, where I focus on various kinds of embedded devices, mainly industrial control systems. And I was previously a security researcher with the University of Twente in the Netherlands, where I focused on critical infrastructure protection, mainly in utilities, gas, electricity, water, and so on, with a specific focus on embedded binary security. And I also focused on host-based and network-based intrusion detection systems, analyzing them, building them, that kind of stuff. So a little roadmap. I'd like to start out with a little background, discuss what are real-time operating systems, binary security, and so on. Then I'll present a quantitative analysis of the current state of embedded exploit mitigation adoption. I'll present a few examples of real-time operating systems that have adopted such mitigations and show how the various challenges in this field affect the quality and the various challenges in their implementation. Then I'll outline what I think are suitable criteria for deeply embedded exploit mitigations, and I'll finish off by presenting MicroArmor, which is a deeply embedded mitigation baseline I designed to meet those criteria. So what is this talk not about? It's not about the kind of embedded operating systems that are derived from general purpose operating systems, such as Linux, BSD, or Windows. It's also not about high-end real-time operating systems like real-time Linux, Xenomai, or QNX. So what is it about? It is about the kind of tiny real-time operating systems that you might find in very deeply embedded systems, such as radios, smart locks, ECUs, industrial control systems, and so on. Think VxWorks, Riot, FreeRTOS, that kind of stuff. So what is a real-time operating system? A real-time operating system is an operating system that is capable of guaranteeing a response time within particular time constraints. And that's important in safety-critical applications, let's say braking system in automotive, avionics flight control computers, that kind of stuff. And here it's more about predictability and determinism than about the actual speed. So there's a whole spectrum of real-timeness, ranging from soft real-time requirements, where the usefulness of a particular result degrades after a deadline has been missed, to hard real-time requirements, where missing a deadline constitutes a system failure. And many of the tiny real-time operating systems I'm talking about today are implemented as library or so-called unikernel operating systems. So they're implemented, the OS, as a collection of libraries, and they link them together with the application code into a single firmware image that's usually loaded into a single address space. And here there's no program loader. Usually system calls are also implemented as function calls, which saves on context switching overhead and so on. So as you can hopefully see from this slightly confusing picture, over the recent years there has been an uptick in embedded RTOS usage, especially compared to bare metal systems. So there is a rising importance of looking at the security of these RTOSes. And that's because of various reasons, but one of the reasons is increasing connectivity. More and more embedded devices are getting increasingly connected. As you can see in the slide on the left, which depicts a typical IoT stack, there are now protocol stacks everywhere. You want your device to be able to talk to a gateway, you want it to be able to talk to different nodes, you want it to be able to talk to smartphones, and even maybe some integration with the cloud. And corresponding to that, but not only to that, is a general increase in embedded device complexity. So there are more processors, there's more memory on those devices, and there are more peripherals. And in many of these cases, simple control loops or state machines that you might encounter in bare metal devices are not enough. So here you want a real-time operating system to manage this kind of complexity. And as you can see in the table on the left, which is extracted from a recent bar group study, you can see that operating system complexity increases with an increase in the number of processors found on a board. So I want to specifically focus on a single aspect of RTOS security, namely embedded binary security, which is the security aspects that relate to memory corruption vulnerabilities. Why? Because memory corruption is a big deal in the embedded world. As you can see, one slice of it at least, in industrial control systems, a recent Kaspersky study found that buffer overflows comprise the biggest single category of vulnerabilities found. And the impact of such vulnerabilities is heightened due to many different factors, which are particular to the embedded world. First of all are the patching issues, which most of you will be familiar with. There's like fragmented responsibility, who is responsible for drafting and creating a patch in the first place. There are usually a lack of secure updating mechanisms. How do we get the patch to the device in the second place? There are availability availability issues, especially if you look at safety critical devices or devices which have high uptime requirements. When are you going to patch, a monitoring system that seeks to prevent a nuclear reactor meltdown? Safety issues as well. If you have safety code that requires certification, if you introduce new patches, then it will require the code to be recertified. So that's an additional problem. And all of these problems together, they lead to long vulnerability exposure windows. So that means that especially if you consider that device lifetime might outlive the fact that the vendor offers support for it, then you'll have vulnerabilities which will never ever be patched. You could call them forever days. On top of that, there is usually no privilege separation. So many of these devices run a single address space. They have a flat memory model. So escalation from any vulnerability in application code to kernel code is trivial. And the exploits tend to scale well that you write there. A single bug in a single protocol driver can affect billions of devices where this kind of code is reused. So ideally, we'd solve this problem by using safe languages, like everybody has heard, like in their computer science or electrical engineering classes. The problem is that despite the fact that the embedded world has seen some older and newer attempts at embedded suited languages, such as ADA in the past, or recently attempts at doing Rust for embedded systems, unsafe languages continue to dominate embedded software development. From that same recent bar group study, found that the vast majority of currently written embedded software is written in C or C++, which are unsafe languages, and only a tiny minority is written in a different language, and that's not necessarily a safe language either. So what are we to do here? Well, this is where exploit mitigations come in, and exploit mitigations shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet. They're kind of a stopgap solution, but they do help in increasing the complexity and reducing the impact of any vulnerabilities that are found. And we know from the general purpose world that exploitation has been getting harder over the past years. And you can see this in the progression of team sizes in the pwn-to-own competition, whereas in 2010, a single skilled individual could get away victorious. In 2016, it requires a double-digit team of very skilled individuals. So what about the embedded world? Yeah, right, no such luck. So here are some examples of recent vulnerabilities affecting devices running real-time operating systems, and some of them not so recent. And as you can see, whether it affects Wi-Fi chips, whether it affects basebands or the operating system itself, in none of these cases exploit mitigations were present, which drastically simplifies exploitation once a vulnerability has been found. And you can see from the recent Broadbone vulnerability, which some of you will be familiar with, that the impact here can be very, very serious. So in order to get a little bit of a better picture than, a couple of hand-picked examples, I did a quantitative analysis of the current state-of-the-art of embedded exploit mitigation adoption. And here I basically composed a minimum baseline of what I think the absolute minimum in exploit mitigation should be. And that's composed of executable space protection, also known as DEP, non-executable memory, or write execute protection. And this effectively ensures that data memory is not executable, at least on a von Neumann architecture, and that code memory is not writable. The second mitigation is address space layout randomization, which randomizes code and data memory to prevent attackers from using a code reuse attack, such as return-oriented programming. And the final one are stack canaries or stack smashing protector, which inserts a randomized canary value between the return address and the other stack metadata and the local variables to prevent stack buffer overflows from being exploited. And I chose these mitigations because they are complementary, they work in a mutually reinforcing fashion, and they also have a long legacy of adoption in the general purpose world. So I selected 45 popular embedded operating systems, from high-end ones to low-end ones, and from Linux, Windows, and BSD-based ones to proprietary small real-time ones, and I evaluated them for support for this mitigation baseline. And keep in mind that this assessment is an optimistic one, so if a mitigation was present and it was supported only for one of the architectures the operating system supports, then I marked it as present, even regardless of implementation quality. So here you can see the overall trend, and we can see that even if we consider all the operating systems in the selection together, that support is already quite flaky, topping out at 50% at most. But once you start eliminating the mobile operating systems tailored to smartphones and modern tablets, and the ones based on Linux, Windows, and BSD that you might find in embedded systems, this support starts to rapidly drop. And if you look at the deeply embedded end of the spectrum, which is where all these tiny real-time operating systems live, almost none of them have support for any of these mitigations. So what's going on here? Is this simple laziness on part of the vendors, or is something else going on? Well, turns out something else is going on. So these mitigations have various hardware and software dependencies. So in the case of executable space protection, you can implement it in multiple ways. You need to consider the fact that there are two main architectural styles of CPUs. There's the Harvard architecture, broadly speaking from the programmer's point of view, where code and data memory are separate, so you trivially have this kind of protection present. But on a von Neumann architecture, this kind of separation is not present, so you can execute data memory. In that case, if you want to implement ESP, you will need to rely on a dedicated hardware feature, such as the NX bit on x86. Because if you don't have it, you have to fully implement it in software, and that comes with additional overhead. Regardless of how you choose to implement it, you will need an operating system that has memory protection support. So, the memory manager needs to be aware of all this functionality. And then on part of the hardware, you need either a memory protection unit or a more fully featured memory management unit to support all this stuff up the tree. In the case of ASLR, you will need virtual memory support because you need to have the tasks or processes or whatever have private virtual memory to prevent shared memory conflicts. Because if you randomize a particular memory object, let's say the stack or a piece of code memory, and you randomize another piece of memory, you need to know whether you're not placing it at a place that has already been occupied. And virtual memory trivially ensures that this is not an issue. You will also need an operating system secure random number generator in order to ensure that the randomization of the memory object is done securely and unpredictably. And in order to ensure virtual memory support, you will need a memory management unit on part of the hardware. So I also mapped out the software dependency support among these operating systems, and you can see that while memory protection support is generally relatively well supported, this is not so much the case for virtual memory and operating system secure random number generators, and it shows the same downward trend with a deeply embedded spectrum, like tailing behind all the way at the end. In order to get a picture of support for these hardware dependencies, I selected 78 popular embedded core families, because that's a nice round number. And they're from different kind of architectural families, ARM Cortex-M, you name it. And I evaluated them for hardware dependency support in this baseline. So if you look at that, you can see that hardware ESP support tops out a little over 40% here on the right, and that's mainly due to the efforts being done in the recent ARM families. You can see that for MMUs, support is a little under 50%, and then there's a little over 10% that have an MPU if they don't have an MMU. It should be said that this is for the von Neumann architectures only, because this is only relevant for them. So even if an operating system were to implement all these software features, even if they were to implement the exploit mitigations and said we want to make good work of this, then they still can assume that the hardware they're going to be deployed on or want to be deployed on has all the necessary dependencies. And apart from that, there's also the problem that there are many, many more challenges in adopting these exploit mitigations for deeply embedded systems. First of all, there are the resource and system constraints. We're all familiar with the limited resources in the embedded world. There are limitations on code size, memory size, there are limitations on power consumption, computing power, all that kind of stuff. And the overhead that any mitigation you design imposes on a system influences the likelihood of adoption. You can, meet all these dependencies and it can be deployable, but if the overhead is too much, people will just say we're not going to deploy it. And then, it's worthless. Secondly, you need to take into account the fact that there are availability requirements. Some mitigations, as part of their response to detecting an attack, will take down a particular task or will shut down the entire system as part of their standard design. But in some systems, you need to guarantee a high system uptime, and it might even be worse to take down a system as a response to an attack than to just let the attack run silently and hope that at least the device remains semi-functional. So you need to offer some modularity in the responses here. And then there's potential conflicts with real-time requirements. For example, virtual memory has various caching and page fault behavior that introduces a degree of non-determinism that conflicts with real-time requirements. And you need to be able to address that kind of stuff as well. Secondly, there's the issue of advanced processor features. People who have kept up with relevant literature in exploit mitigations, especially if you look at the work in control flow integrity, know that modern mitigations increasingly rely on advanced processor features. Intel CET feature, Intel LBR, PMU, you name it. The problem is that these kinds of features are only present on modern high-end CPUs. And even if they were to be adopted by certain families that are suited for the embedded space, then because of the wide diversity in hardware in the embedded world, if you design an operating system, you cannot assume that this functionality is present in all the hardware that you want to be deployed on. So, you're also constrained in that regard. Finally, there's the issue of embedded random number generators, because a lot of mitigations require a degree of secure randomness as part of some kind of secret or the randomization of addresses, and you want to do this in a secure manner. And too often you see people think of secure randomness as something that should be up to the system integrator, so the people who buy an operating system and develop a product. But in my opinion, secure randomness should be an operating system service, because you can't say to many system integrators, just use TinyCrypt or embed TLS and, figure out the entropy and the seeding yourself, because that's going to end up with a veil of tears. The problem, however, is that because of this same hardware diversity, there is little omnipresence of any entropy sources you want to draw upon. So what you usually see in designs for embedded systems is they say we draw from sensor values, or we draw from some accelerometer, or something that is present within a particular device or a particular family of devices. But if you design a random number generator that is to be integrated into an operating system, you need to be able to draw entropy across all the kind of hardware you want to be deployed on. Otherwise, you just say, here's a skeleton and implement it yourself, and you end up with the same kind of mistakes. There's also the ever-present problem of the fact that, the embedded world is generally a low entropy environment. I think Matthew Green said it's essentially very boring. So there is little activity going on, and sometimes whatever activity is going on is very predictable. And these conditions are worst at boot time, especially if you want early initialization randomness before a lot of the devices have been initialized, before a lot of the drivers have been loaded, all that kind of stuff. And this leads to the so-called boot time entropy hole. And this is especially terrible if you consider the fact that a lot of cryptographic keying material is usually generated very early in boot, as well as secrets used in mitigations. On the downside, we can't wait for entropy too long either. We can't just say, okay, we'll wait during boot time until we have enough entropy, because then your system startup times become very slow. So you have a catch-22 here. And the result is that you see a lot of not-so-random number generators in the embedded world, or very bad workarounds. And for some more details on that, I refer to my talk at last year's CCC, where I discussed some examples of this. So now I'd like to focus on some mitigation examples from real-world real-time operating systems and how some of the downsides of their implementations relate back to these challenges I discussed. The first operating system I'd like to discuss is Sapphire, which is a library-based RTOS based on Wind River Rocket, and it's an open-source project by the Linux Foundation aimed at resource-constrained IoT devices, anything from gateways to nodes and anything in between. And it's very young. It was started in 2016, but it's promising because it has input from major chip makers. As you can see, Intel, NXP, Synopsys, Nordic, as well as having an explicit focus on security. So Sapphire currently only implements stack canaries, and their implementation of the stack canaries is based, for those of you who are familiar with the Clang and GCC stack smashing protector implementation. How many of you are familiar with that kind of implementation? All right, that's a small minority. So essentially, I assume most people know what stack canaries are, but it's a value that's randomly generated and stored in between a return address and a local variable, so that an attacker trying to overflow a local buffer into the return address overwrites a value that they don't know. And when the function returns and the return address is popped back into the program counter, the value is checked before that happens, and if there is a mismatch, an attack is detected. So what they changed in this implementation is that a canary failure, which usually on general purpose operating systems results in taking down a single application, now causes a kernel panic. So a full system is taken down, and that's a little bit iffy from the availability side of things. They generate one master canary value for the entire address space, which on the one side is, means that if you compromise one of the tasks or one piece of code, you compromise all of it, but it also makes sense because, it's a single address space operating system anyway. This value is generated once at system boot, and it's never ever refreshed after, which is a downside, but not that big. And it's generated using their random number generator API, as you can see here. And the implementation of that API depends on the chosen random driver. So with Sapphire, there are a couple of options here. Either you rely on the true random number generator that is provided by a board. And in this case, it has a couple of drivers for the boards that it seeks to support that have true random number generators, for the NXP Kinetis family, for the STM32 boards, and for the ESP32 boards. But this is only a small minority of the boards that they seek to support and that have a true random number generator. So driver availability here restricts the choice of random number generator. On top of that, even if drivers were available for all the boards that have a true random number generator, not all of the boards that are supported by Sapphire have a true random number generator. In fact, only a small majority has. And it's important to note that of this small majority, the vast majority are ARM based. So if you look at x86, let alone ARC or NIOS2 based boards, there is very little support for a true random number generator, which means that they have to rely on a pseudo-random number generator. And this is the big problem, because they only provide insecure pseudo-random number generators. There are two approaches which are more or less the same, but a little bit different in implementation. The first of which uses the x86 read timestamp counter instruction, which is not very random at all. It's a low entropy source. And the problem is that this value is the very first value that is drawn from the PRNG, and there is little difference as a result between canaries between different boot runs, because the timestamp counter is almost the same value at this point every time it gets drawn. On top of that, the timestamp counter value is also used in a lot of public fields. So network fields that need some random value, they use the timestamp counter. So all of this is broadcast, as part of network packets. And because it's not drawn from a PRNG, but just a timestamp counter, people can reconstruct it, because it's not even pulled through a PRNG, insecure or not. And the same thing holds for their timer-based random number generator, which suffers from all the same issues, even though it's a little different implementation. I had some contact with the Sapphire team, and luckily their internal team had found some of the same issues, and they now have plans to integrate an operating system secure random number generator, usually or most likely one based on the NIST SP 819A standard. So that's some good news moving forward. The second operating system I'd like to take a look at is the Fuchsia OS. How many of you have heard of this? Yeah, that's what I expected, because it's a very mysterious, under development Google RTOS. It was pushed to GitHub without any official statement in August 2016. Some people have been speculating it's supposed to be a replacement for Android or something like that, but there's nothing really sensible to say in that regard. If you look at the code, it seems intended for the entire embedded space almost, from small IoT devices up to smartphones, which it could support. You can even run it on a desktop machine. It's based on the Magenta microkernel, which is derived from little kernel, and it has virtual memory and MMU support, as well as having kernel user space separation. So I was surprised to find out that they actually supported all of the mitigations in my baseline as the only tiny RTOS. So that's very good news. They seem to be taking this seriously for this embedded segment. They support executable space protection, but on the downside, they do so relying solely on the x86 MMU features. So that means that if you want to deploy it anywhere else, if you don't have an MMU or a non-x86 architecture, you can't use this feature. They also support address space layout randomization, and they ensure that all the executables are position independent by default, which ensures that code memory is fully randomized. Randomization, as you can see here, draws on a global operating system secure random number generator, so that's also good. The downside is that it's integrated into the virtual memory management engine. So I'm not sure how they reconcile their usage of virtual memory and MMUs with some of the real-time requirements. So it could be the case that in those cases, developers will have to disable virtual memory if they want to ensure those requirements. And that would also mean that there is no randomization. So that's a little downside, which relates to those challenges I discussed. They implement stack canaries, also simply being compliant with the GCC stack smashing protector model. And they generate a single early boot canary, as you can see here. And the canary is generated by drawing on a hardware random number generator, namely the x86 RD-rand instruction. The downside is that if this fails for whatever reason, so they can draw from it for whatever reason, or they are deployed on a board which does not have support for this, then they have a fallback value to a static value, which kind of defeats the purpose of stack canaries, because you can just put this in between your overflowing buffer and your hijacking of the control flow, the instruction pointer, and then you can bypass it. Also, a little bit of a downside is the fact that, as the same with Sapphire, a canary failure results in a kernel panic, which is a little bit of an availability issue. So I'd also like to discuss 2 academic examples, because they also show that despite good intentions, if you don't keep a lot of challenges and limitations in mind, you can actually inadvertently end up helping attackers. So the solutions I'd like to discuss are MAVR and AVRAND, which are boot time code diversification schemes for the AVR architecture. So that essentially means that they randomize code memory in an attempt to prevent code reuse attacks, such as ROP. The MAVR solution was designed for the Ardu pilot UAV system, and the AVRAND solution was designed for the AVR chip in Arduino Uno boards. One downside already is that MAVR requires significant hardware modification. So they say, we require an additional master processor as well as an additional flash chip, and that's not so much on the bill of materials. I think a lot of embedded devices manufacturers will beg to differ there. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that both solutions re-randomize and initially randomize by reflashing the chip. So every N restarts, the code memory is re-randomized and then the chip is reflashed. And this also happens after every crash based on watchdog timer. So the problem here, as some of you can already see coming, is that an attacker which cannot even hijack control flow, they can trigger a crash. Or they can force a reset by, jumping to a reset factor or something like that. And that means that an attacker can reduce the device lifespan by forcing a reflash and thus exhausting the program erase cycles on the device flash. And actually, they present here people with an additional attack vector as part of their exploit mitigation. So that's something you really need to keep in mind when designing these kind of solutions. So based on these challenges and all this stuff I looked at, I outlined what I think are suitable criteria for deeply embedded exploit mitigations. If people want to design this and you want them deployable, it should probably fit those criteria. So when it comes to the mitigations themselves, I think low resource pressure is really important. So at most, across all metrics, 5% overhead. And I don't really pull this out of my ass, but it comes from prior work. It needs to be as hardware agnostic as possible, so no relying on any specialized hardware features that you might encounter in this one chip that's kind of popular but not really. Also no hardware modifications that require people to re-engineer their chips. Those things are unlikely to be adopted. Thirdly, you want to offer a degree as good or as bad as possible of availability preservation. At least as part of your response to detecting an attack, you should have a modular policy that allows for some availability preservation. You need to take real-time friendliness into account, so use non-deterministic code. You also should be easily integrable into existing RTOSes without requiring major design overhauls, because people are unlikely to do that. Secondly, when it comes to secure random number generators, because those are so important and you can't really talk about mitigations without talking about secure random number generators, we have the same low resource pressure requirement. So use lightweight crypto. There are a lot of well-tested and understood primitives and schemes out there. So, if you're concerned about that kind of stuff, use them. Also keep in mind entropy gathering limitations. So for the initial seed entropy of the random number generator, you need to ensure that any entropy you draw is rapidly available upon boot. You also need to avoid any constant polling of runtime, because that's very power draining if you constantly poll for additional entropy. You also need to ensure that you don't rely on domain-specific entropy sources. Like I mentioned, no sensor values or accelerometers that are not widely deployed. So this brings me to the final part of my talk, which is microarmor. And that's the deeply embedded exploit mitigation baseline I designed to meet those criteria. And it consists of micro ESP, micro Scramble, which is essentially an ASLR replacement, micro SSP, and a tiny operating system secure random number generator named microRNG. The target systems it seeks to be deployed on are either a Harvard-style CPU or a von Neumann one with hardware ESP support, and a single address space real-time operating system or a bare metal system. The attacker model seeks to protect against remotely exploited control flow hijacking attacks, so someone trying to exploit a vulnerability of a Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or RF. No local attackers, that's out of scope for now. And only control flow hijacking attacks, so no data-only manipulation and that kind of stuff. I implemented it on a representative platform, which consisted of an ARM Cortex-M3 microcontroller and the Sapphire RTOS. The first component is micro ESP, which uses the available memory protection unit to enforce executable space protection, as you can see by implementing the permissions here. So code is made read-only and executable. Data is made non-executable and read-write. I also ensured that the stack grows away from the data as a safety measure. It's also important to note that micro ESP limits the code reuse surface, and it does this by sensitive code that is known to run only once is made non-executable after it has run. And this is done for code that cannot be relocated by the diversification code, like the bootloader, because otherwise you have statically located sensitive code that might be used as part of a code reuse attack in the return to bootloader style attacks. I also ensure that after all this has run, the MPU and the system control block are locked down to prevent any MPU disabling later on. The second component is micro Scramble. As we've seen, we needed an alternative for ASLR for these deeply embedded systems. And essentially it helps to think of ASLR as just one strategy among many in the field of software diversification. So you can diversify software at many moments in time, when you compile, when you boot the system, when you run the system, etc. And there are many different things you can diversify, parts of the code, parts of the data. So micro Scramble was designed as a hybrid compile and update time solution, and it's integrated into the firmware generation process, as you can see here, as part of the compiler infrastructure. And it generates a per device different firmware image. So when the initial firmware is loaded, it's loaded on different devices, all different images. And the same is done in the update mechanism. So that's also different firmware images. And that prevents scalability of any code reuse attacks. The benefits here are that it has very limited overhead because there's no diversification that actually takes place on the device itself. So that's very good. There's no requirement for virtual memory. And it works on the source code, so it's platform independent and transparent to the developers. The diversification itself consists of 3 transformations: function reordering, dead code insertion, and register preservation. And these were chosen both with regards to the requirements I had stipulated, as well as with the fact that they are fine-grained. So whereas ASLR only randomizes code memory with respect to the base address, this randomizes gadgets with respect to the image base, with respect to the function base, functions with respect to each other, as well as reordering the register preservation code. And the upside of this is that different memory objects are decorrelated, which means that if you have an information leak which leaks the location of one particular memory object, or you have a brute force attack that manages to discover another memory object, you cannot deduce the location, at least not trivially, from this particular location by means of a static offset. So this is what they look like. I guess you could have already figured from the names, but the function reordering reshuffles the order in which the functions are laid out in the firmware. Then the dead code insertion varies the sizes of the functions, and it does this by inserting after the actual function. It inserts a couple of trap instructions, which are never actually run in normal execution, but an attacker that might try to blindly code reuse might end up with the trap instruction and thus invoke a violation handler. And finally, there is the register order preservation reordering code. And as you can see, most functions have scratch register saving code and restoration code. And this is a popular target for code reuse attacks. Because if you, as part of a return-oriented programming attack, want to set a particular register to a particular value, then you reuse part of this. But there's no reason why they are laid out in a particular order. So I vary this, and that means that you break assumptions an attacker makes about the values of registers throughout their payload. Another component is micro SSP, which is very simple and essentially the Sapphire SSP scheme, but it was modified to ensure that the master canary is always drawn from a secure random number generator, and I also implemented a modular violation handler. So as part of its response, you have a passive response, which just logs an alert we're under attack, but allows the attack to continue, hoping that the attacker also wants the device to remain available. The second response is the same as the original one. It simply invokes a fatal system error. Then we have the option to terminate only the violating thread in question or restart it if that's possible, or terminate the whole system or restart it if that's possible. Obviously, the possibility here and whether it's suitable depends from device to device, so that's up to the system integrator to make a particular choice. But at least it's modular and people have a choice. Then there's the final component, which is micro RNG. That's a Ketchuk for, how many of you are familiar with Ketchuk? Oh, that's good. That's a Ketchuk-based operating system secure random number generator, and Ketchuk forms the core of, for example, the SHA-3 hashing function. It offers 128 bits of security and uses a very small 25-byte internal state. It uses, because it's a sponge-based algorithm, uses one algorithm for entropy gathering as well as random number generation, so that limits the actual code size, and I integrated it as the Sapphire random number driver. As you can see here, it avoids the constant reseed polling by linking the reseed control to the actual output function, so actual runtime reseeding is only done at the moment that output is generated. Very important and very big problem was to decide on an initial entropy source. So where do we get our initial entropy from? And here I made a choice to rely on SRAM startup values. As many of you will know, SRAM cells essentially consist of two cross-coupled inverters, and due to manufacturing differences and due to the way they're manufactured, these are often unstable during startup, but after a brief period of time they will converge to a given value. And in the manufacturing process, there are sometimes manufacturing differences between these two inverters, which leads to one being significantly faster than the other. And that leads to a biased startup value, so they will always start up with a 0 or with a 1. And this property is commonly used in what are called physically unclonable functions. So if you want to get a fingerprint that is device unique, you basically take the SRAM cell and you get this POF fingerprint, and there you have it. The converse property is that there are some other cells which do not have this manufacturing difference, or where it's not significant enough. And that means that actually the convergence is governed by environmental noise. And that makes them a very suitable source of initial entropy. This has many benefits because all of the SRAM is initially available at boot very rapidly, which solves the boot time entropy hole problem. Secondly, it differs between devices and boot runs, which ensures good diversification. And finally, SRAM is omnipresent on most microcontroller units, so that makes for a very good source. I also did, for those who are interested, an overhead and a security evaluation of MicroArmor. So when it comes to the overhead, I evaluated the code size, data size, memory usage, and runtime overhead metrics, and I did so by evaluating them against a set of IoT sample applications, as well as the TackleBench evaluation suite. The overhead in terms of code size with respect to total device resources was less than or equal to 5%, which is quite good. And for all the others, it was less than or equal to 1%, which meets our criteria. You can also see here that micro-RNG is significantly smaller than a lot of earlier work. When it comes to the security evaluation of micro-Scramble, I did the coverage analysis. So I generated 1,000 firmware image variants per benchmark. And then I harvested any of the RRP gadgets. And here I measured the gadget survival rate. So that essentially means that if you have a firmware image and you have a gadget at a particular address, in how many other firmware images does the same gadget live at the same address? And that measures the scalability of a code reuse attack. So the maximum average gadget survival rate I spotted was 10.50%, which is quite good considering the fact that there are complicating attacker factors, such as the payload length. You don't need, like if you need multiple gadgets as part of your RRP chain, you need all of them to scale well, and not all of them might scale equally well. Secondly, firmware complexity factors in. The more complex the firmware, the less the gadget survival rate because of the fine-grained randomization nature of microscramble. And the fact that this same fine-grained randomization also complicates the actual discovery of any gadget. So if you discover a gadget, you cannot deduce any others, or at least a very limited subset of any of the others, based on the one you discovered. Micro-RNG, I also did a security evaluation. Luckily, Ketchuk is well analyzed and well understood, stood up to a lot of cryptanalysis. When it came to passive state recovery attacks, I ensured that it reseeds at least every 1 gigabyte of output, so it remains well within the 32 gigabyte bound established in prior literature, and we don't have the boot time entropy hole because all the entropy is instantly available upon boot, as I discussed. When it comes to the initial entropy, you do need to keep in mind that the suitability of SRAM as an initial source for entropy depends on the chips. So in order to seed our random number generator, we need roughly 2 times as many entropy bits as we have security strength, so in our case 256 bits. The average entropy as found out by prior work listed here is roughly 5% of the total SRAM size. So there were worst cases, because this is quite good, and in most cases, as you can see here, it also scales well across temperatures. The worst case that was found in prior literature was for PIC 16F microcontrollers, which had 1.2% entropy in the SRAM. The problem is that it also has very small SRAM, so you have too few bits. You need to keep this in mind if you want to deploy this. In reality, you also need to consider that the SRAM will be slightly contaminated by the time you draw it into your PRNG state, so you need to ensure that you harvest in very early boot and that you also limit any memory usage. Finally, there are issues around memory retention, so those are minimal at normal ambient temperatures, but the problem is that in cold temperatures for some chips there is a very clear loss of SRAM and entropy, so you shouldn't, if that is your use case for your device, you should keep that in mind, or at least ensure a full SRAM reset between power cycles of the device. So this brings us to the limitations, conclusions, and future work. Some of the limitations, because MicroArmor, it's intended as a first small step, it's far from perfect, and I just hope people build upon this. The platform is a limitation because you need either a Harvard-style CPU or a von Neumann one with hardware ESP support. Outside of that, we don't have a good way to ensure ESP yet without this hardware kind of support. The attacker model is a limitation because we only guard against remote control flow hijacking attacks, so no data flow attacks, no local attackers. And the fact that the diversification is limited. So the frequency of relocation is a problem. We only relocate at compile and update time, so not every boot run and that kind of stuff. The coverage is also limited to code memory only, so no diversification of data memory yet. So in conclusion, embedded memory corruption issues warrant serious attention. Even the smallest of devices are connected these days, and unsafe languages continue to dominate the embedded world. The current state of embedded exploit mitigations is terrible, especially in the deeply embedded segment where tiny RTOSes are deployed, and this is not easily fixed either. And finally, MicroArmor, which I demonstrated, is intended as a small step forward for people to work on. When it comes to future work, I see 2 main trajectories. One is the long-term one, which basically consists, in my opinion, of people starting to take embedded safe language adoption seriously, and you can see people in the Rust Embedded project and the TOCOS project taking this quite seriously, as well as making work of secure and scalable patching solutions across the space. And in the short term, in order to cover this long term, I'd like to see mitigation baseline adoption across RTOSes, as well as increased hardware dependency support and work towards advanced embedded mitigation such as control flow integrity and execute-only memory. And that's it. If there are any questions, I'll take them now.
We are out of time for questions.
I expected as much.